I want to just a history lesson for you. My daughter was born on August 28th, 2005. At the hospital, they joked we should name her Katrina. Why? Because outside, the storm was raging. Now, I am from Louisiana, and Katrina was a disaster, the scars of which you can still see almost 20 years later. Katrina was awful. My wife actually worked with a lady whose family refused to move. They knew the storm was coming. People said the storm surge was going to be great. They lived in southern Mississippi, but they lived several miles inland from the coast. They thought they would be fine. They found the whole family in a live oak. They were all alive, thank God, clinging for their lives. I'm not making that story up. The whole family, the storm surge came in, washed the house away, and they clinged to each other and a live oak. It was that bad. Bridges and roads and whole towns washed away by the storm surge of Katrina. It was awful. And it happened while George W. Bush was president. He had gotten into his second term, had won with 51% of the vote against John Kerry. Democrats had peddled conspiracy theories all that November that sound very familiar. The Diebold electronic voting machines in Ohio were rigged. Ken Blackwell, then the Secretary of State, he somehow or another was able to fraudulently rig the system to ensure George W. Bush's reelection. The Democrats went nuts over Bush's reelection, and the media went nuts with them to a degree. And when Katrina rolled through, the media and the Democrats together pushed a narrative against George W. Bush that he was so focused on the war that he was incompetent when it came to the domestic front. And Katrina became the albatross around his neck, and he had several missteps. Brownie, I forget the guy's name, Michael Brown, was it, who was in charge of FEMA? FEMA did a terrible job in the initial stages after Katrina. The storm was far more dangerous than, they knew it was going to be a bad storm. It was far worse than they even projected. And FEMA did a terrible job. Actually, the Southern Baptist Mission Board was the first organization on the ground. They even beat in Walmart, and Walmart came in before the federal government. You know, the Waffle House rule? You can tell how bad a storm situation is by whether or not a Waffle House is open or on limited menu or closed. There were Waffle Houses that no longer existed, clean slates, just the concrete slab where they had been. That's how bad Katrina was. And FEMA screwed things up, and it was hung around George Bush's neck by the Democrats. He had flown Air Force One over the New Orleans area. They tipped the wings and turned so he could look out the window. He did not want to land in New Orleans because he did not want to distract from the recovery efforts. The airport was not in good condition to begin with, and he didn't want them to have to distract from cleanup to clean up the airport for him to be able to land. And the Democrats said, look, he doesn't even care. He just flew over you and looked. He didn't even land. And it hung around George Bush's neck. There was no way for him to win on that, of course. Had he landed and they redirected resources to clean up the airport, they would have attacked him as well. But it sunk in that George Bush was so focused on a war overseas, he had lost his focus on people at home. He didn't care. The guy who seemed to care, the guy who hugged people, the guy who was crying with everybody all the time, he just no longer cared. He wasn't competent to handle this stuff, and it stuck. His polling never recovered. There were other things as well, but it was Katrina. Joe Biden has had his Katrina moment, and I don't know that he will ever recover. And the Democrats should have been mindful of this. He should have been mindful of this. Joe Biden was one of the people who capitalized on George W. Bush after Katrina. He should have known, to quote Jeremiah Wright, the chickens have come home to roost for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's polling collapsed and went negative in Afghanistan. You don't have to know all of the details of Afghanistan to know that the American public went from looking at Joe Biden as the man who cared and was not Donald Trump. He was actually competent. He knew how to manage the government. It turned out he was an incompetent biblical donkey who might have dementia. The growing polling from Americans who think there might be something wrong with Joe Biden, something the media doesn't talk about, and only a few pollsters will poll on it, but there's a growing body of evidence that suggests Americans aren't quite sure Joe Biden isn't out to lunch. Maybe he's out to lunch, maybe not. More people think he is than used to. But also, overwhelmingly, people don't think he's competent. They think he's incompetent. And they don't like him very much anymore. They don't think that he's the guy. He campaigned as caring and compassionate, and he would put his arm around you. He had a tragic life story with his first wife and his child being killed, and the man knew how to relate to other people. He made it all about relatability. Remember the Muslim dad, the soldier who spoke at the Democratic Convention? He was not actually as partisan as people claimed, but Donald Trump went after him for his criticisms, and they had him at the Democratic Convention, and his point was that Joe Biden cared about his son. But Joe Biden didn't care about your sons and daughters in Afghanistan. Those 13 soldiers got killed. The Taliban stormed in way quicker than they should have. We allowed them to come in, and we left Americans behind. Americans don't leave Americans behind, but Joe Biden did. You don't really recover from that. And so now we're in the situation where inflation is high. 7%, the highest it's been since 1982, the consumer inflation. But it's not just that. The consumer price index is up, but industrial inflation is actually at a record high. It's not just consumer prices. Inflation is off the chain. The administration is incapable of battling back the virus. Joe Biden said he would beat the virus, that he was more competent than Donald Trump. He could beat the virus, not contain the virus, not manage the virus. He would beat the virus. And now this morning, Joe Biden's urging Americans to mask up yet again. They told us to get vaxxed, get boosted, live your life. And now they're saying, but in an N95 mask, and we're going to make it freely available. And by God, you better wear it. They can't beat it. They can't get voting rights passed in the Senate. Kyrsten Sinema right now is speaking on the floor of the United States Senate saying there is no way in hell she's changing the filibuster. That kills the voting rights measure. Joe Biden poured all of his political capital into a cause he lost before he began it. Makes him not look competent. It also, he poured all of his energy into a voting rights measure that was lost before he began, and he didn't do anything like that with COVID. And he can't get it done. And in the process, he dared to divide Americans, calling people who disagree with him a racist. A president, the Quinnipiac poll has at 33%. By the way, let me give you clear perspective here. At 33%, the lowest Donald Trump ever win in the Quinnipiac poll was 37%. So Joe Biden is more unpopular than Donald Trump ever was. He's more unpopular by 7 points than Gerald Ford was after he pardoned Richard Nixon. And a president with only a third of the support of the American public wants the Democrats in the United States Senate, who will hold 50 of 100 seats, to break the rules of the Senate, to unilaterally change and get rid of the filibuster through breaking the rules of the Senate that require a 2/3 vote to actually change the rules. He wants them to change the rules with only 50 votes, plus a tie breaking from the vice president, in order to pass a law to keep Democrats in power, and yet says it's the Republicans who are the threat to democracy. Joe Biden had his Katrina moment in Afghanistan, and his administration was too clueless to realize they needed to undo the damage. He dug his heels in on Afghanistan when all of his advisors told him not to. And the repercussions, we're still feeling them. We're still feeling those repercussions. Joe Biden not only lost Afghanistan to the Taliban, he's on the verge of losing his power to the Republicans because it turns out the public's right. He doesn't care, and he's not competent, and he might just have dementia. And nothing his administration has done since Afghanistan has done anything to change people of that perception. But that perception has become the presupposition in every news headline involving Joe Biden that the public encounters, and they're not likely to change it anytime soon. And the result is doom and gloom for the Democrats headed to November. They're already openly in Washington now talking about the Republicans might just take back the Senate too, something that even 4 months ago was a hypothetical and now looks more like reality. And it all comes down to Biden and everything he's done on every single issue since Afghanistan has struck the American public as uncaring, not compassionate, and not competent. And his White House, all they can do is what Democrats always do: scream racism.